At exactly 9:17 a.m., the phones inside Madison Ridge Holdings went silent. The trading floor froze, screens blinked red, and billions evaporated in minutes. Loyal employees raced to log in, hitting refresh like it could undo what had just happened, but the truth had already come crashing through the doors. The empire, built over 4 decades, cemented in boardrooms, and celebrated in glossy magazines, was unraveling faster than anyone believed possible, and all of it started with one voice memo sent from a desk no one thought mattered. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the quiet before the collapse, most people only knew Madison Ridge as a Fortune 500 titan. They saw sleek headquarters, gleaming quarterly reports, and executives feigning confidence in every televised interview. But underneath, cracks had been growing for years: hidden entries, inflated assets, numbers that barely matched reality. And then something happened that no spreadsheet could predict. Carly Bennett, an internal audit director with a reputation for being meticulous and unflinchingly honest, noticed a pattern that didn't add up. Not a small error, not a rounding discrepancy, a trail of manipulated entries that made billions look better than they truly were. What she uncovered was bigger than she expected. The company had been masking losses by quietly shifting funds through shell entities, overstating profits across multiple divisions. Others saw the same signs, but Carly's instinct told her this was different, this was deliberate. One night, long after everyone else had left, she sat alone at her desk staring at a cluster of spreadsheets. Her hands shook as she drafted the first internal report, not just outlining the issue, but proving it with cross-checked records, timestamps, and third-party bank logs. She knew that sending it could change everything. Carly thought of her team: loyal, hard-working people whose entire livelihoods depended on Madison Ridge. She thought about her aging father's medical bills and her son's college tuition. And she wondered, if this were you, would you want the truth to come out? The morning she hit send, she had no idea her email would eventually be forwarded to regulators and then to a major financial news outlet, sparking a firestorm that would bring auditors and federal investigators flooding in, shuttering trading desks, freezing accounts, and leaving thousands stunned. By midday, the stock was in freefall. By evening, executives were scrambling to explain themselves to stunned reporters. And by the end of that week, the company was declared insolvent. Looking back now, you wonder, what would you do in her shoes? Would you stay silent? Or would you risk everything? That decision, one sent email, changed countless lives forever. Maya Collins was 34 years old when she walked into Madison Ridge Holdings for the first time, carrying a plain leather bag and a resume that no one in the executive wing bothered to read closely. She wasn't loud. She didn't dress to impress. She spoke carefully, choosing accuracy over charm. She had grown up in a middle-class neighborhood where bills were paid on time but barely, where her mother worked double shifts and her father reminded her that stability mattered more than applause. That upbringing shaped her into someone who listened more than she spoke and noticed details others rushed past. By the time she became a compliance analyst, she had already learned a quiet truth about the corporate world: the people who talk the most are often the least aware of what's really happening. Maya never announced her intelligence. She didn't need to. She assumed, incorrectly, that good work would speak for itself. And so, from her first week, she was overlooked, underestimated, and quietly placed in rooms where no one thought she could hurt them. At meetings, executives spoke over her without realizing she was taking notes that connected dots they didn't even know existed. She was assigned tasks others saw as tedious: reconciling reports, reviewing internal controls, cross-checking vendor transactions. To them, it was background noise. To Maya, it was a map. Late afternoons often found her alone in the office, the faint hum of printers and the smell of burnt coffee lingering as she compared documents line by line. She noticed how certain approvals always bypassed standard review, how the same subsidiaries appeared again and again when losses needed to disappear. Once, she raised a question during a meeting. The room went quiet for half a second before someone chuckled and said, "That's above your scope." Maya nodded, wrote it down, and didn't argue. Inside, though, she felt something settle, not anger, but clarity. She had learned long ago that being ignored could be a strange kind of freedom. When no one watches you, no one stops you from seeing everything. 6 months later, Maya's access expanded. It wasn't a promotion, not officially. A senior manager quit suddenly, and someone needed to cover the workload. Maya volunteered without making it sound like ambition. That decision changed everything. Overnight, she could see internal audits, compliance exceptions, and correspondence marked confidential. She noticed how the numbers executives proudly cited on earnings calls didn't align with what internal reports showed. At first, she assumed there was an explanation she hadn't seen yet. She wanted there to be one. But the deeper she looked, the worse it became. Losses were being shifted between quarters. Risk exposure was being hidden through shell entities. It wasn't chaos, it was organized. Purposeful. Maya remembers leaning back in her chair one evening, staring at her screen, thinking, if this were an accident, it would be Messier. That was the moment doubt turned into certainty. Ask yourself honestly, if you discovered something like this at your job, would you trust your instincts, or would you convince yourself you were mistaken just to sleep better at night? Maya didn't sleep much after that. She replayed conversations in her head, remembered dismissive smiles, casual jokes about numbers people who didn't understand the bigger picture. She documented everything quietly, saving copies, logging timestamps, building a trail that couldn't be waved away. No dramatic confrontations. No threats. Just evidence. The irony was painful. The same people who ignored her now trusted her with their most sensitive data. One afternoon, during a routine check-in, an executive casually said, "You're solid, Maya. Low maintenance." She smiled politely while her stomach tightened. They thought her silence meant agreement. They thought her calm meant compliance. What they didn't know was what Maya had access to, or how carefully she was connecting the pieces. She wasn't plotting revenge. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She was trying to understand the truth and what responsibility came with knowing it. And somewhere in that quiet office, with the sun setting through the glass walls, a decision was forming that would soon force everyone to pay attention to the woman they never took seriously. The Harrington family had never thought of themselves as villains. In their world, power was simply inheritance refined by strategy. Their conglomerate stretched across energy, logistics, and finance, woven so tightly into global markets that even regulators spoke their name carefully. Generations earlier, a Harrington patriarch had turned a regional operation into an international empire, and every successor learned the same lesson early: never apologize, never explain, never admit weakness. They were old money, but not quiet money. Their influence traveled through private dinners with senators, through charitable foundations that doubled as networking hubs, through law firms that existed almost entirely to protect Harrington interests. When competitors challenged them, those companies didn't just lose contracts, they lost access, credibility, sometimes their leadership. To the Harringtons, this wasn't cruelty, it was efficiency. If you were crushed, it meant you didn't belong at the table. Their world was sealed off from consequences. Private jets waiting on short runways, engines humming before the passengers arrived. Board meetings held in rooms where the art on the walls cost more than most people's houses. Exclusive clubs where deals were finalized over quiet laughter and old stories, where mistakes were reframed as temporary misunderstandings. The Harrington heirs grew up watching problems disappear, not because they were solved, but because someone else absorbed the damage. A lawsuit here, a settlement there, a regulatory inquiry quietly redirected. They believed accountability was for smaller companies, for executives without the right last name. Confidence became habit, and habit became carelessness. When you live long enough without consequences, you stop imagining they exist. That belief shaped every decision they made, including the ones that would eventually expose them. Inside Madison Ridge Holdings, Harrington executives mirrored that attitude. They spoke in absolutes, dismissed concerns with practiced smiles, and trusted that their legal teams would smooth over anything inconvenient. When internal reports flagged inconsistencies, those documents were buried under layers of approvals until urgency faded. One executive liked to say, half-joking, "By the time anyone figures it out, we'll be 3/4 ahead." Laughter followed every time. They assumed regulators moved slowly, journalists needed leaks, and employees needed paychecks. Silence, after all, had always worked before. They didn't fear people like Maya Collins because they didn't really see people like her. To them, analysts were replaceable, compliance was decorative, and risk only mattered if it became public. That assumption was their blind spot, and blind spots grow dangerous when left unexamined. The Harringtons believed they were untouchable because history told them so. Decades of power had insulated them from doubt, and doubt is what keeps systems honest. No one challenged their version of reality inside those glass towers. No one expected a quiet analyst to understand the machinery well enough to stop it. Their confidence felt earned, almost reasonable, given how often it had protected them. But confidence without accountability has a cost, even if the bill arrives late. And in this case, it arrived disguised as routine work, as harmless questions, as one woman doing exactly what she was hired to do. That confidence, built over generations and reinforced every day, is exactly what made them sloppy. The meeting was scheduled for 45 minutes and held in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, the kind of room designed to remind everyone inside who mattered. Maya's invitation came late the night before, added as an afterthought, her name tucked beneath a long list of senior executives. She understood immediately why she was there. Not to speak. Not to challenge. To sit quietly and validate the appearance of transparency. When she arrived, the Harrington family members were already seated, jackets draped over chairs, phones face up on the table. No one stood when she entered. A senior partner gestured vaguely toward an empty seat near the end. As the meeting began, Maya listened as projections were discussed with absolute certainty, numbers delivered confidently despite contradicting what she had seen firsthand. When she finally spoke, carefully, respectfully, outlining a compliance risk tied to internal transfers, her words barely landed. Someone interrupted mid-sentence. Another smiled thinly and said, "You wouldn't understand the scale we're operating at." The room moved on as if she hadn't spoken at all. Maya tried again, this time referencing documented discrepancies, offering a solution that required nothing more than temporary disclosure and correction. The response was laughter, polite but sharp. One executive leaned back and said, "Let the adults handle this." A Harrington cousin glanced at his phone while she spoke, scrolling without shame. Another asked if she was finished before she had completed her thought. The insults were subtle, delivered with calm voices and relaxed posture, which somehow made them cut deeper. Maya felt heat rise to her face, not because she was embarrassed by her work, but because she was watching truth be treated like an inconvenience. She looked around the table and realized no one was listening anymore. They had already decided who she was. A formality. A box checked. She wondered how many times this exact scene had played out with other voices that eventually went quiet. And she asked herself a question that many people face in moments like this: if they refuse to hear you when you speak gently, what happens when you stop asking for permission? The breaking point came without drama. A Harrington family member laughed openly this time, shaking his head as if amused by a child pretending to be serious. Another checked his phone again, then placed it face down with a sigh. Then someone said it plainly, without malice, without even looking at her, "You should be grateful to even be in this room." The words landed and stayed there. No one corrected it. No one softened it. Silence followed, thick and deliberate, the kind meant to signal finality. Maya felt her pulse in her ears. She thought of her mother's tired hands, of every time she had been told to be patient, to be quiet, to wait her turn. She thought of the files on her computer, the evidence neatly catalogued, the truth waiting without emotion. She realized then that this meeting was never about risk or solutions. It was about reminding her of her place. And in that moment, something shifted. Not anger. Not fear. Resolve. Have you ever been spoken to in a way that made you understand exactly how little you were valued? And did it make you smaller, or did it make you sharper? Maya didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She closed her notebook slowly, met no one's eyes, and said, "Thank you for your time." The meeting ended shortly after, executives standing and chatting as if nothing unusual had happened. As Maya walked out, she noticed how steady her hands were. That surprised her. In the hallway, the air felt cooler, quieter. She stopped near a window and stood there longer than necessary, watching traffic move far below, thinking about restraint. They mistook her calm for submission. They assumed silence meant surrender. What they didn't realize was that Maya had already done the hardest part. She had listened. She had confirmed intent. She had seen, clearly, who they were when confronted with truth. This wasn't ignorance on her part. It was restraint. And restraint, when finally released, carries weight. As she returned to her desk, she opened a folder she had labeled weeks earlier and began preparing for a conversation that would not take place in a conference room, with people who believed they were untouchable. And if you were watching this unfold, knowing what she knew, would you have done anything differently? Or would you have waited for the moment when silence was no longer an option? That night, Maya sat alone in her apartment with the lights off, the city's glow leaking through the blinds. Her laptop stayed closed on the kitchen table, untouched, as if opening it would make everything too real. For the first time since the meeting, doubt crept in. Not doubt about the facts, those were solid, but doubt about herself. She thought about walking away, about updating her resume, about finding a job where compliance meant something and people listened before it was too late. She imagined the relief of distance, the quiet comfort of deciding it wasn't her responsibility. Someone else will catch it, she told herself. Someone with more authority. That thought lingered longer than she liked. It felt like permission to disappear. And for a moment, she wanted it. Ask yourself honestly, when faced with a fight you didn't choose, how often have you wished you could just step aside and let someone braver handle it? As the hours passed, memories surfaced uninvited. Maya remembered being a junior analyst years earlier, presenting a risk assessment only to be told she was overthinking things. She remembered a supervisor smiling kindly and saying, "Stay in your lane, you'll go far." She remembered nodding, swallowing frustration, learning when to speak and when silence was safer. Those moments had shaped her, taught her how to survive in rooms that didn't make space for her voice. But survival had a cost. Sitting there now, she realized how often she had been rewarded for being agreeable, how rarely honesty had been encouraged. The Harrington meeting wasn't an isolated insult, it was a pattern she recognized too well. And patterns, she knew, were exactly how systems failed, slowly, predictably, and with everyone claiming surprise afterward. The thought made her uneasy. Leaving wouldn't just protect her peace. It would protect theirs. Maya opened her laptop just before midnight. Not to send anything. Not yet. She reviewed the files again, calmly, methodically, checking dates, cross-referencing communications. She imagined future headlines, the confusion, the finger-pointing, and she wondered how many people would say they had no idea. She thought about the employees who trusted the company with their livelihoods, about investors who believed the numbers they were shown. She asked herself a harder question: if this collapses and I stayed quiet, could I live with that? Most people would have left angry, slammed doors, told friends how unfair it all was. Maya left the room that day with something more dangerous than anger. She left observant. She saw exactly how far they were willing to go to avoid accountability, and exactly how confident they were that no one would stop them. And in that quiet clarity, her choice began to take shape, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of responsibility. What the Harringtons never bothered to ask was why someone like Maya Collins had been brought in at all. On paper, she was a consultant. In practice, she was something far more specific. Her career had been built in the margins of regulation, in the quiet intersections where international law, supply chains, and financial reporting overlapped. She specialized in regulatory exposure, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's too late. She understood how a shipment routed through the wrong subsidiary could trigger investigations across borders, how an overlooked compliance failure could activate agencies that didn't answer to anyone in that boardroom. International compliance wasn't abstract to her. It was procedural, detailed, and unforgiving. She had spent years studying how systems failed not because of one big mistake, but because of many small ones no one thought to question. And Madison Ridge was full of them. Maya knew where the company was vulnerable because she had been hired to find those exact weaknesses, just not to talk about them in the wrong rooms. She saw how their supply chains crossed jurisdictions with conflicting regulations, how documentation was quietly adjusted to save time and money, how temporary solutions became permanent shortcuts. To executives, these were efficiencies. To regulators, they were violations waiting for a timestamp. She mapped dependencies, traced approvals, and noticed how often the same family-controlled entities appeared at critical choke points. If one piece failed, others would follow. And she understood something the Harringtons didn't respect: complexity doesn't protect you, it exposes you. The larger the system, the more places it can break. Sitting at her desk, she realized she didn't need confrontation. She didn't need to raise her voice or make threats. The structure itself carried the weight. She didn't need revenge. She already had leverage. Leverage in the form of documented patterns, jurisdictional triggers, and timelines that told a story no press release could erase. Maya began planting seeds quietly. She scheduled routine reviews that expanded scope just enough to require external verification. She asked neutral questions in emails, phrased carefully, knowing how responses would be archived. She requested clarifications that forced departments to contradict one another on record. Each step was ordinary on its own. Together, they formed a trail. She wasn't rushing. She understood that systems like this didn't collapse from one blow, but from pressure applied consistently at the right points. And the Harringtons, confident and distracted, approved every request without concern. What they didn't see was how exposed they really were. They assumed risk could be managed the way it always had been, with influence and delay. They believed their reach extended everywhere that mattered. But Maya was working in spaces where influence didn't help, where rules were enforced by process, not persuasion. As weeks passed, she watched the company's internal contradictions grow harder to hide. Small alarms began to trigger quietly, the kind executives ignore until they become impossible to silence. And somewhere between routine audits and polite emails, the machinery of accountability was already in motion. If you knew what she knew at that point, would you have realized what was coming, or would you have trusted that power alone would keep you safe? When people imagine the moment everything changes, they picture drama. Raised voices. A call to a journalist. A lawyer on speakerphone. Maya did none of that. The phone call that mattered happened on a quiet afternoon, between meetings, with the office humming as if nothing in the world was about to shift. She closed her door, checked the time, and scrolled to a contact she hadn't spoken to in years. An old professional connection from a previous role, someone who now worked inside a regulatory agency most executives pretended didn't exist until it was too late. When the call connected, Maya didn't introduce herself with urgency. She spoke calmly, professionally, as if this were just another routine clarification. "I think you should look at this file," she said. "I believe it affects national compliance." There was no explanation yet, no accusation. Just precision. On the other end, silence stretched longer than was comfortable. Then a voice replied, measured and alert, "Send it immediately." Maya ended the call and didn't move for a moment. Her heart wasn't racing. That surprised her. She felt steady, almost detached, as she attached the first encrypted file and double-checked the recipient. This wasn't gossip. It wasn't a complaint. It was documentation. Timelines. Cross-border transactions. Internal acknowledgments that contradicted public statements. The kind of material that didn't need interpretation to be troubling. As the files transferred, Maya thought about how easily this could have gone another way. How close she had come to walking away. How often people confuse silence with safety. She wondered how many times systems survive because the right person decides it's not their problem. And she asked herself a question that most people never want to face: if accountability only works when someone speaks up, what happens when everyone waits for someone else to do it? The response came faster than she expected. A confirmation receipt. A follow-up request for additional documentation. Specific questions that told her she was being taken seriously. This wasn't curiosity, it was activation. Over the next few days, she sent more files, each one carefully labeled, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. No emotional language. No speculation. Just facts. Inside Madison Ridge, nothing appeared different. Executives still joked in hallways. Meetings still ran long. The Harringtons still moved through their world with ease. That was the strange part. The contrast. While they assumed everything was under control, a parallel process had already begun, one that didn't require their permission or their approval. Maya watched it unfold quietly, continuing her work as usual, answering emails, attending meetings, never hinting at what she had set in motion. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt responsible. The call hadn't been an act of defiance, it had been an acknowledgement of reality. Systems like this don't fall because of anger. They fall because the truth reaches a place where it can no longer be ignored. The Harringtons had spent decades believing exposure only came from noise and scandal. They never imagined it would arrive calmly, professionally, through the proper channels, sent by someone they barely remembered speaking to. And if you were in their position, convinced of your own protection, would you have noticed the moment the balance shifted, or would it have felt, just like it did then, like another ordinary day? At first, the consequences arrived so quietly that no one connected them. A routine audit notice landed in an inbox, flagged as standard procedure. A shipment was delayed at a port due to documentation review. A bank requested clarification on a transfer that had always gone through without question. Regulators asked what were described as routine questions, the kind that usually resulted in a polite response and a closed file. Inside Madison Ridge, these moments were treated as minor inconveniences. Executives shrugged them off in meetings, confident the machinery they had relied on for years would smooth everything over. One Harrington joked that this was what happened when companies grew too large to move quickly. Laughter followed. No one mentioned Maya's name. No one thought to. After all, nothing had broken yet. But the pattern was there for anyone willing to see it. Delays that used to resolve in hours stretched into days. Requests for clarification came back with follow-up questions attached. External auditors asked for documents that had never been requested before, referencing regulations that applied across borders. The supply chain team began quietly rerouting shipments, trying to avoid choke points without fully understanding why they were forming. Banks placed temporary holds on certain accounts, not freezing them, just enough to cause discomfort. These were not accusations. They were pauses. And pauses, in systems built on momentum, are dangerous. Maya noticed the shifts immediately. She said nothing. She simply logged the dates, the language used, the departments affected. She understood that this was how pressure built, not through spectacle, but through accumulation. The Harringtons laughed it off because laughter had always worked. In private lounges and closed-door meetings, they dismissed the developments as overcautious regulators and risk-averse institutions. They'll move on, one executive said confidently. They always do. Lawyers reassured them that nothing here rose to the level of concern. Politically connected advisors promised to make calls if needed. There was no sense of urgency, no internal reckoning. To them, this was noise, not a signal. They had survived worse headlines. This felt like nothing. And that belief, that nothing serious could happen without warning, allowed the cracks to widen unnoticed. Then one email arrived. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't use alarming language. It was short, formal, and precise, requesting a consolidated set of documents by a fixed deadline. The sender wasn't someone they knew, and the agency name carried weight in a way that made the room quieter when it was read aloud. Conversations stalled. Phones stopped buzzing. For the first time, the laughter didn't come easily. The tone shifted, not to panic, but to attention. And if you had been there in that moment, watching confidence give way to calculation, you would have felt it too. Something had changed. And nothing was going back to normal. The midpoint came suddenly, like a storm breaking through a clear sky. What had started as small delays and routine questions now converged into a revelation no one could ignore. Auditors compiled reports that exposed decades-old violations carefully hidden behind layers of subsidiaries and shell companies. Transactions labeled as consulting fees were traced to offshore accounts tied to bribery schemes. Environmental records revealed illegal dumping, projects where corners had been cut so blatantly it was impossible to pretend ignorance. Internal memos detailed labor exploitation overseas, workers paid fractions of what was promised, contracts intentionally obfuscated to avoid scrutiny. Each piece on its own was troubling, but together, the story was unmistakable. The empire the Harringtons had built wasn't just flawed. It was built on intentional, systemic deception. Maya sat in a conference room, surrounded by reports, spreadsheets, and corroborating evidence, the magnitude of what she was seeing pressing in like gravity. She had expected discrepancies. She had anticipated irregularities. But this level of deliberate wrongdoing was staggering, even to someone who had spent years navigating corporate loopholes. She realized something crucial: the truth wasn't illegal by accident. It was illegal by design. Every corner cut, every record adjusted, every payment rerouted, all part of a structure meant to exploit, evade, and conceal. The Harringtons hadn't stumbled into wrongdoing. They had constructed it carefully, confidently, and for decades. And they had assumed that no one would notice. For Maya, the emotional weight was immediate. She had always been methodical, analytical, calm under pressure, but looking at this mountain of evidence, she felt the responsibility of being the first person to truly see it all in one place. Not just the financial implications, but the human cost, the employees misled, the communities affected, the people harmed by systems designed to hide their suffering. Every suppressed memo, every altered file, every deliberate omission pointed to the same conclusion: this wasn't a mistake. And she had seen it. She had cataloged it. And she knew what it meant. The Harringtons were untouchable in their own eyes, but that perception had a fragile foundation. And as Maya left the room that evening, folder in hand, the calm precision she had relied on since her first day felt heavier than ever. She had a choice now: to act, or to remain silent. But silence, she understood in that moment, was no longer an option. The fallout was slower than a headline but faster than the Harringtons could process. Emails flew between law firms, drafted in haste, signatures hastened, each carefully worded to protect assets, reputation, and family legacy. Private jets remained grounded, conference rooms filled with hushed meetings where lawyers explained the gravity in phrases designed to soothe but not alarm. The family, accustomed to control, felt it slipping through their fingers for the first time in generations. Internal blame began almost immediately: executives pointing at one another, cousins whispering behind closed doors, managers arguing about who had failed to catch what. Everyone had a theory, no one had proof, and everyone knew that proving it was the least of their worries. The empire they had assumed was unshakable was suddenly porous, vulnerable, and exposed. The moral lines blurred quickly. Younger family members, the heirs in training, were bewildered. They had been taught ambition and confidence, but not the secrets that built their wealth. They believed in their own innocence, unaware of decades of decisions made in shadows, of corners cut deliberately, of oversight consciously ignored. The elders, those who had steered the empire through decades, had known exactly what they were doing. They had hidden violations, manipulated systems, and ensured that compliance remained a surface-level exercise. It was a family built on loyalty and secrecy, and that secrecy now became its greatest weakness. But even in this chaos, the most shocking betrayal had yet to reveal itself. Everyone assumed the threat came from regulators, auditors, or the press. They expected an external force to strike and prepared accordingly. What they did not anticipate, and what would dismantle their confidence entirely, was internal, methodical, and precise. A quiet force that had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. Someone who had every reason to stay silent, who could have left the empire to its devices. And yet, that person had seen everything, understood everything, and had already begun to act. The Harringtons believed they were untouchable. They were about to learn that the greatest danger often comes from the one they least expect. The first media reports arrived quietly, hidden in the business section of a morning paper, almost easy to miss. A footnote about an ongoing investigation, a mention of unusual regulatory requests, a hint that something at Madison Ridge Holdings didn't add up. But the story gained momentum fast. Whistleblower protections were activated, giving Maya the legal cover she needed to hand over the meticulously documented evidence. Governments and regulatory agencies across multiple countries began formal inquiries. Suddenly, what had been internal chaos became public spectacle. Stock tickers turned red, then darker red, trading halted in some divisions as panic spread among investors. The Harringtons, long accustomed to controlling the narrative, realized they no longer could. Their empire, celebrated in magazines and lauded in conferences, was bleeding in real time. Inside the family headquarters, panic replaced arrogance. Phones rang incessantly. Lawyers debated damage control. Meetings convened and dissolved with no solutions. Younger family members, blindsided, struggled to grasp the extent of what was being revealed. Elders, for all their experience, were forced to reckon with decades of concealment now illuminated under scrutiny they could not command. The power they had wielded so effortlessly had become meaningless in the face of procedural scrutiny, public opinion, and legal mandates. The lines between wealth, influence, and accountability blurred in ways they had never experienced. Their mistakes, their arrogance, their deliberate concealment, all were now laid bare. Meanwhile, Maya remained calm, methodical. She had been underestimated, dismissed, humiliated in private meetings, mocked as a formality, told to stay in her lane. And yet, every calculated step she had taken was legal, precise, and unassailable. They had assumed that power alone could protect them, that appearances and influence were enough. But Maya had not acted impulsively, emotionally, or vindicatively. She had acted with restraint, intelligence, and purpose. They humiliated her in private. She exposed them legally. And as the story exploded across news outlets, with stock prices plummeting and global markets taking notice, it became clear the Harringtons' greatest vulnerability had never been regulators, competitors, or journalists. It had been the quiet analyst they had overlooked, underestimated, and treated as insignificant. And in that quiet, deliberate exposure, the empire that seemed untouchable began to crumble. As the Harrington empire bled publicly, the world began to see the ripple effects far beyond boardrooms and trading floors. Workers who had long endured unsafe conditions, underpayment, and opaque management policies stepped forward. They spoke cautiously at first, then with increasing clarity, recounting overtime denied, labor violations ignored, and ethical corners cut to protect profits. Communities once promised development and investment found their neighborhoods polluted, resources mismanaged, and local economies destabilized. Hospitals, schools, and small businesses that relied indirectly on the conglomerate's operations reported losses and disruption. The human cost, invisible for so long, suddenly became undeniable. News stories highlighted families affected by layoffs, employees struggling to navigate bureaucratic chaos, and communities grappling with environmental damage. Maya's meticulous documentation allowed investigators to connect the dots, not just for financial crimes, but for ethical and societal violations. It was no longer a story of a corporate collapse alone, it was a story of real lives disrupted by systemic negligence and deliberate deception. The Harringtons' arrogance, their belief in untouchable power, had consequences that extended far beyond personal wealth. People who had no voice, no influence, and no platform suddenly had their experiences validated. This was never just about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation or one woman's vindication. It was about accountability. Maya had been dismissed, mocked, and silenced for months, but her actions revealed a fundamental truth: power without responsibility leaves destruction in its wake. She hadn't acted out of spite. She had acted out of principle, ensuring that those who had been harmed had a chance to be heard, and that the systems that enabled injustice could be examined, corrected, and, wherever possible, prevented. In that reckoning, the story shifted from scandal to human consequence, from corporate intrigue to the broader impact of choices made in rooms no one else could enter. The climax arrived not with fanfare, but with precise, cold efficiency. Arrests were made quietly in the early morning, doors opened by authorities who had studied the Harringtons' every move. Assets were frozen, accounts seized, yachts grounded, private jets grounded. Board members resigned or were removed under regulatory orders, and the family's influence, once taken for granted, began eroding publicly. Buildings that once proudly bore the Harrington name were renamed or repurposed. Their legacy, carefully curated over generations, began to vanish under the weight of accountability. The empire they assumed untouchable now faced consequences that no amount of wealth or influence could evade. Through it all, Maya remained unseen. She gave no interviews, offered no statements, and did not appear in front of cameras. She did not walk into the limelight to claim victory, nor did she craft speeches for public acclaim. Her satisfaction was private, measured not in applause or attention, but in the certainty that the systems enabling abuse had been confronted and disrupted. She didn't act for recognition. She acted so that the same mistakes, the same violations, could never be repeated without consequence. This wasn't about making them remember her. It was about making sure they, and anyone like them, never did it again. And in that quiet resolution, Maya achieved something far greater than revenge. She restored the balance that arrogance and unchecked power had long threatened to erase. After the storm had passed, Maya returned to her life as quietly as she had disrupted the Harrington empire. She walked past newsstands filled with headlines recounting arrests, asset seizures, and corporate collapse. The world knew the story, the world debated it, the world watched it unfold, but no one recognized her in the street, in cafes, or on the subway. She moved through the chaos she had created as an observer, invisible, ordinary, carrying the weight of what had been accomplished without spectacle. There were no congratulations, no fanfare, no medals to display. Her victory was measured in restored accountability, in the knowledge that truth had prevailed where silence and arrogance had once ruled. Maya understood something the Harringtons never would: power doesn't always shout. It doesn't always demand attention or recognition. Sometimes, it waits patiently, quietly building leverage, observing, calculating, until the moment arrives when arrogance and unchecked confidence collapse under their own weight. And when it does, those who think themselves untouchable learn, often too late, that the quiet hand of responsibility can be far stronger than the loudest voice in the room. Maya didn't need the world to see her. She only needed the world to see the truth, and that, in the end, was enough.